Hello and welcome, everybody. I'll do a short introduction of our speaker today, and then I will hand it over to him to make his presentation, after which we'll be taking the audience questions. So welcome, Robert. Robert Ivermee is a global and imperial historian focused on colonialism in South Asia. He works in higher education management at SOAS University of London and teaches at the Catholic University in Paris. He has recently published his book called Hooghly, The Global History of a River. Today, he'll be speaking to us on trade, conquest, enlightenment, and revolution, the forgotten history of French colonialism in Bengal. So without much further ado, I hand it over to Robert to speak to us today on trade, conquest, enlightenment, and revolution. Over to you.
Thank you, Priyanka, and thank you, Mohammed Ahmadullah, for your organization of Bengal History Week, as ever. I had the privilege of speaking once before the Bengal History Week in person, and it's great to be back to speak again. Let me share my screen. Thank you all for being here as well, I should say, for sparing an hour or two to listen and hopefully take part when we get to the conversation. All right. Ahmadullah, I think you need to give me permission to share my screen.
Yes, should have done that earlier.
Make me a host. Okay, excellent. Thanks. All right. Excellent. Hopefully you can see my first slide there. Okay. So the talk that I'm going to do today is largely based on the book that Priyanka mentioned in her introduction, and thank you for that. So Hooghly, The Global History of a River, that was published last year. The book is a study of the different European presences on the Hooghly River in Bengal through the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. There is a chapter on the Portuguese, several chapters looking at the English, the Dutch and Danish have a look into, and there's one chapter of the book that focuses on the French presence in Bengal, which is the basis for what I'm going to say today. I should maybe mention in passing that the new project that I'm currently working on is looking at French in India more widely. So I think we lack a good English language introduction to the French presence in India in the 17th and 18th centuries. So some of what I'm going to say is new research, I hope, that builds on what you would find if you're kind enough to read Hooghly at some point. Okay, so my focus today is on the French presence in Bengal over a period of about 100 years, from the end of the 17th to the end of the 18th centuries. The French in Bengal have received relatively little attention from historians in general, certainly less so than the English, for example, in Bengal. The English are, of course, the main European rivals of the French in Bengal in this period. The French in Bengal have received far less attention than the French in southern India, around Pondicherry and the Coromandel coast in this period too, which is perhaps not surprising because as events develop, it's Pondicherry in the south that is the capital of the French territories in India, and of French efforts to create a territorial empire in the middle of the 18th century that we will touch on today, or more than touch on, in fact. Where the French in Bengal have received attention from historians, there are several myths that are quite often perpetuated that we're going to try to dispel tonight. One is that the French in Bengal had a presence that was solely commercial, that unlike in southern India, the French in Bengal had no political or territorial ambitions. as we will see, the fact of having failed to create a territorial empire in Bengal and wider Northeast India does not mean that such ambitions did not exist. A related myth is that while the English East India Company resorted to force to advance its commercial interests and ultimately conquered Bengal by military means, the French presence in the region was peaceful. We will look at that idea and hopefully move away from it a little later. A third, again, related myth is that when the French East India Company, the Compagnie des Indes, did get involved in the politics of the region and resort to military means, it did so only to protect the people of Bengal and the rightful rulers of Bengal from English aggression. There is an idea prevalent in some French historiography that French actions were benevolent and disinterested, anti-colonial rather than colonial in nature, as far as Bengal is concerned. I'm going to suggest that the origins of these myths lie in the period of introspection in France that followed France's defeat to Great Britain in the 7 Years' War, which finishes in 1763, and the resulting collapse of French territorial ambitions in South Asia. It's in this period, in the 1760s, that a strong current of anti-colonial discourse begins to emerge in France. And the history of what has taken place in Bengal and wider South Asia up until that point is rewritten. As we will see in the final 3 decades of the 18th century, as the French remain in India, their presence is invested with new meanings, and some French figures in Bengal do start to claim a responsibility to free the province from what they refer to as the tyranny of English dominance. But this too is far from a disinterested position. As the 18th century draws to a close, French projects to expel the English from Bengal are justified by notions like liberty and the rights of man, but those projects are as much about advancing French national interests in the face of English dominance of Bengal as they are about some kind of disinterested or humanitarian impulse. The Franco-English colonial rivalry that in 1870-57 brings the government of the Nawabs of Bengal to its knees continues. That rivalry continues under new guises until the end of the 18th century, before French ambitions are finally defeated during the upheaval of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. But let's begin at the start with the foundation of the French East India Company in 1664. On the right, you have Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the most powerful minister in Louis XIV's government in France. As First Minister of State, he's responsible for financial reform, for huge infrastructure investment in things like roads and canals, and in the French Navy. And he's also responsible for the creation of several trading companies that are set to grab France a greater share of international trade around the world, one of which is the Compagnie des Indes, with its focus on the Indian Ocean. 1664, this is 60 years or so after the foundation of the Dutch and English East India Companies. And so from the beginning, France is playing catch up. Several earlier attempts, in fact, to found a French trading company have failed, largely because of a lack of interested private investors. And so when the 1664 company is set up, it's more so than the English and the Dutch companies, a state-driven enterprise. Colbert is the main driver behind it. Louis XIV, is one of the main investors in the company. And most of the other investors come from quite a close circle of the king's advisors and aristocrats. This is quite a centralized state undertaking. The articles of the company, the title page of which you can see on this slide as well, give the company a 50-year monopoly on trade between France and the Indian Ocean. And alongside its commercial operations, the company is entitled to carry arms, to establish garrisons and forts, to declare war on non-Christians, to engage in diplomacy and make treaties, to administer justice, and to conquer and occupy foreign non-Christian lands. So from the outset, the company is far more than a commercial undertaking. Commerce and colonization go hand in hand, and there's a recognition from the start, but both will likely have to be sustained by the use of force. The company's first voyage in March 1665 is an attempt to colonize Madagascar, which we won't dwell on now, perhaps just to note that this is a failure, and a very violent failure at that. The second voyage, the following year, is the first to arrive in India. So this is 1666. And the first port of call is Surat. Here we have an early 18th century map of southern and central India. Surat, as of course many of you will be aware, is up in the top left-hand corner of this map, where you can see Gujarat, modern day Gujarat, marked. So the company sets itself up in Surat with a trading post. Surat is the main port of the Mughal Empire, just dominating large parts of the subcontinent at this moment. The focus of the company at the beginning is the trade in spices. And so after Surat, it's along the Malabar coast that you can see on the bottom left here, and then on the island of Sri Lanka, Ceylon, that the company tries to establish itself. And its attempts to kind of wean its way onto the island of Sri Lanka meet with Dutch opposition. The Dutch are at this point the dominant European presence on Ceylon, and the first European war between France and one of its European rivals, in this case the Dutch, takes place in the 1670s as a result. The unexpected result of this conflict with the Dutch is the grant to the company of a small territory on the Coromandel coast, on the right here, the southeast India, a village that grows into the French settlement and town of Pondicherry. And with the settlement at Pondicherry of the company, its focus shifts from the trade in spices to the trade in textiles, which are the main local attraction on the Coromandel coast. It's with textiles in mind that the company then begins to think about Bengal. Some of you may be familiar with Francois Bernier, a European physician who travels on his own account to India in the 1650s and spends a decade at the court, in the court of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb as one of his physicians. After leaving Aurangzeb's service in the 1660s, Bernier travels to Bengal. He becomes convinced of the potential for trade there for the French East India Company and outlines the various possibilities of Bengal trade in a series of letters to Colbert and to directors of the French company in Paris. A company agent is dispatched and concludes that yes, the best textiles in South Asia are made in Bengal. The province is very fertile and can also provide a lot of food. And permission is obtained soon after from Aurangzeb for the establishment of a company base on the Hooghly River, the economic heartland, of course, of the region, the start of the Bengal Delta. The French company first sets itself up in the town of Hooghly, which had been founded by the Portuguese in the previous century, and then in 1688 moves downriver to the village of Chandanagar, which is sandwiched between the Dutch at Chinsura and what would in the next decade become the English settlement of Calcutta. This is an early French representation of the Hooghly River and of the Gulf of Bengal, the Bay of Bengal, sorry, in English, the Bay of Bengal. The map needs turning on its side, really. here we see the river flowing, well, from right to left to enter the Bay of Bengal. It really needs turning so that the river is flowing downwards across the page from top to bottom to enter the sea. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, probably not. But if you go to the far right of this map from 1726, you can just perhaps maybe make out the settlement of Hugli, the Portuguese town on the river. If we then move down the river closer towards the sea, you can just about make out potentially before the bend in the river near Calcutta, the stations of the Dutch Chinsurah and the French Chandernagore on the right bank of the river. So the upper part of the image here, what would be or what is the western side of the river. The eastern side is, of course, where the Bengal Delta begins. I only came across this particular image recently, and I was delighted to find it because it's an early and very interesting attempt to map the Hugli in Bengal. The engraving is from 1726 and is made, I think, in Amsterdam, but the drawing, the original drawing and research on which it is based, I think must date to about 20 or 30 years earlier than that. Almost at the time that Calcutta is settled by the English. Okay. So the company is installing itself in the village of Chandernagore. A brick warehouse is constructed, along with a chapel tended by 2 Jesuit priests. In 1696, the Compagnie des Indes takes advantage of local political instability to fortify Chandernagore. This is presented to the Mughal governor of Bengal as a measure necessary for the defense of the French settlement, but it's also the first sign of the company's militarization in northeast India. In early years, French trade is very, very modest. The company attempts to import cloth, firearms, and wine. It attempts to export textiles, saltpeter, and food. Pondicherry relies on food imported from Bengal in this period because the Coromandel is nowhere near as fertile. But the trading post is making a loss. In some years, no ships arrive at Chandernagore from Pondicherry or from Europe at all in the in the settlement's early years. French commercial problems at the turn of the 18th century are not confined to Bengal. And when the Compagnie des Indes' 50-year monopoly on trade between France and India expires in 1714, Colbert's company is wound up. There's a 5-year hiatus before the company is replaced by a new Compagnie des Indes that succeeds in attracting slightly more private investment and inherits the French settlements in India, including Chandernagore, from its predecessor. And it's in the years immediately following the launch of this new company in 1719 that we begin to see signs of prosperity at Chandernagore. French debts are liquidated because the company has borrowed heavily in Bengal to finance its purchases. And as the settlement of Chandernagore grows, additional villages around it are purchased by the company from the Nawab of Bengal. Here we have a plan of Chandernagore from 1720, showing the fortified company headquarters close to the river and the way in which around that fort the village has become a town. We can see several ships represented on the riverbank next to the fort, where the commercial activity of the company was, of course, concentrated. Okay, subsidiary trading posts are opened in the 1720s at Kasim Bazar, the port of the Nawabs of Bengal on the Hooghly, just downriver from the Nawabs' capital, Murshidabad. And French agents are also stationed at Patna in Bihar and at Dhaka. We have a first-hand account from a French visitor to Chandernagore in 1725 that describes the town as bustling and commodious, and maybe in a patriotic note as more beautiful than either Calcutta or Chinsura. The population is estimated in this year, 1725, as being 500 Europeans, served by approximately 1,500 slaves. So we must note that slavery is omnipresent in French territories in the Indian Ocean in this period. At Chandernagore, most slaves come from territories around the Bay of Bengal. They're employed in domestic roles or maybe in the company's warehouses. Elsewhere in the Indian Ocean, it's in this decade, the 1720s, that French slave trafficking really takes off, and the islands of Mauritius and Reunion develop as sugar-producing slave colonies. At Chandernagore, there is also, of course, a free Indian population whose numbers are unknown, but undoubtedly growing in this period as commerce begins to take off. There are two churches, one run by the Capuchins for the European residents of Chandernagore, and the other run by Jesuits that's intended as a mission. It's intended to attract Indian converts. This is another interesting distinction between the French East India Company and its English and Dutch counterparts. The English and Dutch are very wary of missionary presence in their territories, try to keep missionary activity to a minimum, to keep commerce and Christianization separate. The French, in contrast, see in this period commerce and Christianization going hand in hand. They refer, incidentally, to their stations in India as colonies, suggesting a kind of a more permanent presence than might be the case for the English and Dutch at this stage. Okay, in 1731, a new governor is appointed to Chandernagore, Joseph Francois Dupleix, and it's during his 8 years as governor that the colony really flourishes. Prior to Dupleix's arrival, and let me move on the image so that we can see him. Prior to Dupleix's arrival, the main source of income at Chandernagore, which, as I've said, is limited, is the company's trade between India and Europe, and the company ships making a journey between Chandernagore and Pondicherry before then returning to France. Dupleix realizes, however, that wealth can also be created by intra-Asian trade and trade inland in India. So the journey between Chandernagore and Patna becomes routine for inland trade, and expeditions are organized further afield to Dhaka, Chittagong, to Surat, and as Dupleix's schemes become more ambitious, to the Persian Gulf, to the Arabian Peninsula, to Southeast Asia, and even to China from Chandernagore. These are commercial expeditions that employees of the French company and other residents of Chandernagore lead privately. They're not commercial expeditions on the account of in the account of the French company. They're made for private trade, and it's private money, including the fortunes that Dupleix has made through similar activity at Pondicherry, but he invests in increasingly ambitious trading ventures from Chandernagore. In December 1739, Dupleix is promoted to Governor General of all of the French territories in India, and he leaves Chandernagore for Pondicherry. And what follows is relatively well known. Shortly after he takes up his post, France and England find themselves on opposite sides of the War of Austrian Succession in Europe. And this war is seen as an opportunity for the two trading companies to check the growing trade and wealth of the other in India. So Dupleix now turns to war. He becomes an effective war leader, and his ambitions turn from commerce to conquest. With the aid of a fleet of ships dispatched from the Ile-de-France, modern-day Mauritius, the English settlement of Madras on the Coromandel coast is captured by the French in 1746, and an attack is launched on Fort St. David, modern-day Cuddalore, the last English station on the Coromandel. The idea of Dupleix at this stage is to drive the English from Southeast India for good. In March 1748, the War of Austrian Succession is brought to a close, and under the terms of the treaty that's signed in Europe, Madras is returned to the English. But this is just the beginning of the aggressive expansionist policy that Dupleix pursues in India. By this stage, he is convinced of French military superiority and therefore abandons the previous French policy of neutrality in conflicts between local rulers on the subcontinent. In 1749, he supports the violent seizure of power in the Carnatic, the Mughal province in which Pondicherry is based, by a rival dynasty whose leader, the new Nawab Chanda Sahib, recognizes his debt to the French with the generous award of new territories and land revenues in southern India. The Battle of Amber, that's pictured here on the slide, is the battle that leads to the death of the Nawab of the Carnatic and his replacement by the French-backed pretender, Chanda Sahib. The following year, the Nizam of the Deccan, so we're thinking here about central southern India, Nazir Jung, the Nizam of the Deccan, is murdered, and the candidate sympathetic to French interests is installed in his place. So the French policy in southern India of organizing regime change is well underway by this stage in the Carnatic, and then secondly in the Deccan. It's the killing of Nazir Jung that provokes or sparks the English East India Company into action. It finds its own Indian allies and launches into conflict with the French, conflicts fought directly, but also by the Indian proxies that are backed by the two trading companies. So what do these events in the south have to do with Bengal? Let's move on the slide to see our Bengali Nawabs. On the left, sitting on the carpet, is of course Alivadi Khan, Nawab of Bengal, from 1740 through until 1755, and the on the right, the third, how to explain, going rightwards from the carpet, the third figure on the right is Suraj Uddaula, who of course becomes Nawab of Bengal after Alivadi Khan's death in 1755. So here we have a relatively rare painting where we see both Nawabs together. Through the 1740s and 1750s, peace is maintained between the French and English companies in Bengal, despite the deterioration of their relations in southern India. Unlike their counterparts in the Carnatic, the Nawabs of Bengal are sufficiently strong to resist manipulation by their European guests. Alivadi Khan imposes a strict regime of taxes and import duties on European trade, to the frustration of both companies, along with injunctions to preserve the peace. But as Dupleix's successes multiply in southern India, his attention begins to turn to Bengal. After the capture of Madras from the English, he speaks privately about removing the English not only from southern India, but from Bengal as well, and notes a plan to replace Pondicherry with Chandanagar as the capital of French territories in India. After the 9 years that he spent in Bengal, he sees Chandanagar as presenting better opportunities for the company than the Coromandel. And so Alivadi Khan is increasingly wary as Nawab. He responds to the death of Nasir Jung, the Nizam of the Deccan, in 1750 by threatening to seize French possessions in Bengal. The repercussions of what is going on in southern India are beginning to be felt to the north. Between 1751 and 1754, the English gradually gained the upper hand in southern India, and the territorial possessions gained by Dupleix are lost one after the other. The Nawab Chanda Sahib, who's been backed by the French, is captured and killed, and an English candidate for the governorship of the province, Muhammad Ali, is installed in his place. And it's after this that Dupleix is recalled to France. The company directors in Paris have tolerated, maybe tacitly supported, his aggressive expansionist strategy in the Carnatic and Deccan, as long as it's working. But now that its failure becomes clear, despite Dupleix's best efforts to conceal it, he's not particularly open or honest in the letters that he's sending back to Paris. Despite those efforts, Dupleix is recalled to Paris at this moment, although a French army does remain in the Deccan, trying to prop up the Nizam Salavat Jung against enemies within his court and further afield, the Marathas, notably. From this moment, 1754, Alivardi Khan is equally wary of the English and the French. It's in the months that follow Alivardi's death that the English East India Company decides to strengthen the fortifications of Fort William at Calcutta without seeking the permission of the new Nawab, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. And the English company uses the possibility of French aggression in Bengal as a pretext for strengthening those fortifications. And it's this affront to his authority that convinces Siraj to attack Calcutta in June 1756, which is the beginning of the conflict between the Nawab and the English company. For the French, this is a huge opportunity. Relations between the Nawab and the English have deteriorated. There is the opportunity, perhaps, to gain the upper hand. Before attacking Calcutta, Siraj appeals to the French authorities at Chandernagore for military support, but they hesitate, basically, they stall. One of the problems consistently undermining French ambitions in Bengal through the 18th century is the very small numbers of soldiers that the French have stationed there. It's not that Bengal doesn't matter, it's just that there always seems to be another more important priority. It's usually that French forces are tied up in the Carnatic and in the Deccan. And so no concrete support is offered to Siraj in his campaign against the English in 1756. In December of that year, the English company moves to retake Calcutta from Siraj, with forces dispatched from southern India, from Madras. And it's as those forces are on the move that news reaches Bengal that France and Britain are once again at war with each other in Europe. This is the beginnings of the 7-Year War, whose theatres would of course include Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and the Indian subcontinent. And Siraj-ud-Dowlah reasons that surely now that France and England are formally at war, the French will side with him in his campaign against the English company. But once again, he is disappointed. The French governor at this moment, Renee de Saint-Germain, is not convinced that even the combined forces of the French and the Nawab will be sufficient to defeat the English. The English move quickly to retake Calcutta and then agree peace terms with Siraj. They do so before the French can come to the Nawab's aid. And so the window for an alliance between Siraj and the French against the English is now closed. Unfortunately for French ambitions, the English company doesn't stop there, and the decision is taken to capture Chandernagore as well. After a 3-hour bombardment, the French colony falls into English hands, which is a decisive blow for French ambitions in Bengal at this moment. The next step in the East India Company's seizure of power is, of course, the removal of Siraj from the Nawabship and the installation of Mir Jafar, a puppet ruler in his place following the Battle of Plassey in June 1757. And as the Battle of Plassey looms, those French who had managed to escape capture when Chandernagore fell now belatedly come to the Nawab's side and offer their support against the English. So some 50 French artillerymen fight on Siraj's side at Plassey, and a contingent of 300 troops regroups in Bihar to prepare a new campaign against the English under the direction of Jean-Lord de Lauriston, who was previously the head of the French factory at Qasim Basar on the Hooghly. From Patna, from Bihar, where he is regrouped, rather his forces have regrouped, Jean-Lord heads to Lucknow, where he attempts unsuccessfully to convince the Nawab of Oudh, Shuja Uddaula, to invade Bengal and rescue it from English control. When this doesn't work, he heads for Delhi with his 300 troops and forms an alliance with the future Shah Alam II. The forces of law participate in Shah Alam's campaigns against the English in Bihar before Law is captured in January 1761. It's in that same month, January 1761, that in southern India, Pondicherry falls to the English. France's two most important colonies are now in English hands, and its ambitions in India seemingly defeated, as many of you will be aware. The three figures we can see here, Mir Qasim, Shuja Uddaula, and Shah Alam, joined forces to fight against the English at the Battle of Buxar in 1764. The English are victorious, and the well-known event that you can see here, of course, is the effective ceding of the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa to the English East India Company in 1765. Okay, I'd like to move on to turn attention briefly to France in this period. 1763 marks the defeat globally of France in the 7 Years' War. And it's a period, as I mentioned at the start, of introspection, where accepted ideas are being called into question. A period of intellectual and political ferment that terminates 26 years later with the French Revolution. French thinkers of this period are criticizing the Ancien Régime, the French monarchy, and the ideas that it is considered to embody, among them the principle of absolute monarchy, the principle of divine right, and what they see as the religious intransigence of aspects of French society, particularly in the corridors of power in this period. But those same French thinkers are also turning their attention to the practices of France and other European powers in the rest of the world. We see in the 1760s the origins or the development of a powerful intellectual tradition of anti-colonialism in France, informed in part by the recent events in Bengal and southern India. Two of the main French thinkers or philosophes of this period that you will probably be familiar with, at least in name, are Voltaire and Denis Diderot. Voltaire writes in 1763 in a critique of events over the previous 20 years in France and overseas, that competition between France and English has devastated Bengal as commerce gave way to war. He is critical, Voltaire, of Duplessis' attempts to found a French territorial empire in India. He labels them a mistake, and a mistake that the English were able to capitalize on, he says, to conquer an empire of their own. Denis Diderot builds on Voltaire's critique in an influential text published in 1770, the Histoire philosophique et politique des établissements et du commerce des Européens dans les deux Indes. The deux Indes there refers to not only the Indian Ocean, but the European presence in the Atlantic Ocean and America and the Caribbean as well. He says, Diderot, he writes that in the Indian Ocean and in the Atlantic, the expansion of European trade and influence has been founded on military oppression, contrary to the true spirit of commerce, which is the free exchange between different peoples. European expansion therefore lacks moral or legal legitimacy in Diderot's view. In their writings, both Voltaire and Diderot refer to Bengal specifically. They suggest that before the arrival of the European trading companies, Bengal is the richest province and the most populous province in India, with lucrative inland and overseas trade carried out by local and other Asian merchants. He says that this situation of thriving has been ruined by competition between France and England and the East India Company's subsequent ascent to power in Bengal, the result of which has been economic and social collapse. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris, which marks the end of the 7 Years' War, strips France of almost all of its territorial gains in southern India. But the towns of Pondicherry and Chandernagore are returned to the French East India Company on the condition that the French limit themselves to commerce. There are quite strict conditions around the number of troops that can be maintained by the French in Bengal, that Chandernagore should not again be fortified. The governorship of Chandernagore is awarded in this period to a guy called Jean-Baptiste Chevalier, who has been in India for the previous 20 years in the service of the French company. And Chevalier is interesting because it's in him that we see continue to harbour political ambitions in the final 3 decades of the 18th century. Under Chevalier's direction, signs of prosperity begin to return to Chandernagore. There are 3 or 4 ships per year arriving from Europe in this period. And we see the construction on the banks of the Hooghly in this period of a chateau, of a palace for the French governor, Gureta House, just downriver from Chandernagore. But Chevalier is not content with this kind of growing commercial or material success, and he begins developing plans for the overthrow of the English in Bengal. Plans which are often presented in his correspondence using the same language of liberté or human rights that Voltaire and Diderot have started to popularize in France. Chevalier thinks, or at least writes, that the French nation owes to the Bengali people a duty to relieve Bengal from the suffering caused by English oppression. To carry forward his plans, Chevalier opens up a diplomatic correspondence with a host of Indian rulers who he feels might be convinced to side with the French against the English. His first plan is to revive the dynasty of Murshid Quli Khan, who many of you will be aware, furnished the dynasty that furnished the Nawabs of Bengal before Alawadi's seizure of power in 1740. When these plans amount to nothing, he turns his attention to the 3 that we encountered earlier, who were defeated by the English in 1764. He approaches Mir Qasim, who, again, as many of you will be aware, is Nawab of Bengal for 3 years before being removed by the English East India Company in 1763. he approaches Mir Qasim's ally and fellow adversary fellow adversary of the English in 1764, Shuja-ud-Dawla at Lucknow. And when these efforts produce little result, he sends a diplomat, an emissary disguised as a Muslim merchant, all the way to Delhi to try to negotiate an alliance with Shah Alam II, who is by this stage on the throne in the Mughal capital. He's on the throne, Shah Alam, but his power really depends by this stage on the Maratha ruler Mahadaji Scindia, who from his base at Gwalior is responsible for the reinstallation, the propping up, if you like, of Shah Alam on the Mughal throne in 1771. A draft treaty is concluded between Chevalier, representing the French East India Company, and Mahadaji Scindia, by which, in the event of a new war between France and England in India, the Marathas would receive French support in return for a recognition on the French part of Maratha sovereignty over large parts of central India. A separate Maratha leader, Janoji Bhonsle, is also solicited about a possible invasion of Bengal. So Chevalier's plan is that the Marathas are effectively invited into Bengal to defeat the English, after which time power will be shared, but crucially, France will be the dominant European presence. Chevalier's plans are supported by John Law de Lauriston, who we saw earlier leading the French campaigns against the English in Bengal and Bihar during the 7 Years' War. He, by this stage, John Law, is the governor of all French territories in India and based at Pondicherry. To advance his plans further, Chevalier from Chandernagore is relying on the presence of various French figures with military training who, after France's defeat in 1763, have taken employment in different Indian courts where their knowledge of European military techniques and in some instances medicine makes them valuable. The two figures that you can see here are Jean-Baptiste Joseph Jeanti and Renee Maddock. Jeanti serves under Shuja-ud-Dawla at Lucknow and under Shah Alam at Delhi. Renee Maddock is convinced by Chevalier to attach himself to Shah Alam's court and is influential in negotiating the draft treaty between the French, Shah Alam, and the Marathas, represented by Mahadaji Scindia in 1771. Unfortunately for Chevalier, there is no similar support received from authorities in France for these big ambitions. To begin with, after 1763, French ministers and royal advisors are very reluctant to violate the Treaty of Paris and stick to the line that French interests in India must be commercial only. When the possibility of reviving colonial ambitions in India is then entertained, southern India, rather than Bengal, is once again the main focus of the French court's attention. Louis's ministers fail to ratify the draft treaty that Chevalier has concluded, and instead focus on the possibility of an alliance with Hyder Ali of Mysore, to whom a French royal embassy is sent in 1769. And it's only with the outbreak of the War of American Independence in 1775, 1776, that the position of the French authorities in Paris begins to change. A new royal diplomat is sent to India, this time to investigate the possibility of an alliance with Shah Alam and a combined French-Mughal invasion of Bengal, the plan that Chevalier has been advocating for more than a decade. But by the time that this diplomat, Francois Emmanuel de Montigny, arrives in India, it is too late. War has been declared between England and France, and Chandernagore has been occupied once again. This is the most heavy-handed occupation of Chandernagore that we see in the 18th century by the English. The occupation that flows from the beginning of the American War of Independence in 1776. All French men are imprisoned and deported. Merchants' property is seized. And 2 months is given to all French residents of Chandernagore, or at least all male residents, to leave Bengal entirely or face imprisonment until the war is finished. Chevalier tries to flee when the English arrive at Chandernagore in 1776. He, the story goes, jumps out of an open window, goes on the run, and is arrested 3 weeks later by English agents at Cuttack in Orissa. He is deported. He leaves India for the final time just after his arrest, lamenting that his plans to restore the glory of France and liberate Bengal from English occupation are in tatters. The financial costs of the, and this really is my concluding sentiment, I guess, the financial costs of the American War of Independence are one of the final nails in the coffin of the Ancien Régime in France. The French monarchy is insolvent, and it's the attempt to impose a new land tax on the nobility and clergy in France that, of course, sparks the meeting of the États General that brings the French Revolution about. There are several links that we should flag briefly between the French Revolution and the events in Bengal that I've discussed this evening. The first is that the ideas of a revolution, ideas like freedom, equality, and the rights of man, are derived from Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, who, as we have seen, are concerned, among other things, by European colonial abuses in India. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, one of the foundational documents of the revolution in France, is declared to be universally applicable, globally applicable, we could say. And Bengal is mentioned explicitly in the debate in the French National Assembly that precedes the declaration. When the news of the revolution reaches Bengal, the French at Chandernagore have effectively a revolution of their own. The deeply unpopular royalist governor of Chandernagore at this moment, Francois Emmanuel Montigny, who I mentioned earlier, is arrested and imprisoned following the besieging of the Guillotine chateau, where he and his supporters have taken refuge. The principle of representative government is endorsed at Chandernagore. A general assembly is established and a political constitution is written for the colony. The English do their best to undermine this Bengal version of the French Revolution. The deportation of the royalist French governor back to France, where he would likely face imprisonment and potentially execution, is blocked by English ships on the Hooghly. Chandernagore has economic sanctions placed on it. And when, in June 1763, Britain and France are once again at war in Europe, Chandernagore is occupied and its revolutionary government is dissolved. This event effectively marks the end of French colonial ambitions in Bengal, which have been revived, as we've seen, through the 1760s and 1770s. French efforts to dislodge the English from their dominant position in Bengal are over. But, and this is maybe a more optimistic note to conclude on, the political and intellectual currents unleashed by the French Revolution live on. They live on in Bengal and contribute in some way, ways that deserve further research into the ferment of the Bengal Renaissance, with its emphasis on rationalism, positivism, and social improvement. And later, the ideas that emerge among French thinkers in the 1760s of representative government and human rights are, of course, mobilized, adopted, and taken on by Indian nationalists in Bengal in their efforts to challenge English rule on the subcontinent and get rid of the English once and for all. That's probably a good place to stop for now.
Thank you so much, Robert. I think you're still sharing your screen. Okay. I would like to ask the audience, if you want to ask your questions, you can either put them in the chat box or raise your hands and then unmute yourself and ask your questions to Robert. I would want to start by asking you to speak a little bit more about your book on Hooghly, the Hooghly River and its global history. You focus today a lot on the French part of your book, the French colonial bit. But what about the others, like the Dutch and Portuguese? How do you see them in the course of your book?
Thanks, Priyanka. Yes, the book is, when I set out to start writing the book, what interested me is the fact that on the Hooghly River, you have in a short stretch of river the Portuguese, the English, the Dutch, the French, the Danish, even some other European presences briefly in this period. So what interested me at the beginning was the fact that Hooghly was a good route into studying those different European presences. The book starts with the Portuguese, who of course were on the Hooghly earliest, from about 1580. It then considers the kind of parallel rise of the Dutch and the English, their arrival and kind of implanting in Bengal from the 1620s or so. And then it considers the French, who, as I said, arrived slightly later on the Hooghly. There are some themes that run throughout the studies of those different European trading companies. One is the way in which what are ostensibly trading companies become organizations more interested in territorial acquisitions, in conquest, and the way in which that process of transformation takes place, but also the way in which it is justified. So the ideologies that support those transformations, particularly of the role of the English East India Company, but equally of the way in which the French East India Company changes in Bengal from being a solely commercial enterprise at the outset to something else, as we've discussed tonight. There aren't many studies, as far as I'm aware, that try to look comparatively at those different European presences, and not only comparatively, I guess, to see how the different companies fed off each other and how certain ideas and practices were adopted and adjusted by one trading company and the other. So yeah, that situates maybe this talk in the context, yeah, of the Hooghly book more widely.
Thank you, Robert. I was also thinking of the recent book by Shogato Bhaduri on the different colonialisms apart from British imperialism in South Asia, in Bengal, and he does talk about Dutch, Portuguese, and French colonialism, but I think more in terms of their cultural productions rather than the history, the kind of history you are looking at. So yes, we are glad to see that more and more work are emerging in this area. We have a question from Rosie Llewellyn-Jones. Robert, great talk. What happened to Guillotine House?
It was destroyed. I'm not exactly sure when. The latest references that I'm aware of to it date to this revolutionary period, date to the 1790s. I'm not sure what happens next, but I haven't tried to find out. Haven't tried to find out equally. But I'd be delighted. I'd be really interested to know what happens next to Guillotine House. It certainly is no longer present. It's no longer there on the banks of the Hooghly by the middle of the 19th century. Whether that's because of the revolution or for other reasons, I don't know. I'd really like to know.
I think Ahmedullah has a question. Yes, please go ahead.
I'd like to ask you two questions. First, the French trade in Bengal, right? They were buying food, textiles, and the stuff they used to make gunpowder. Did French also engage in inter-Asia trade, or was their trade mainly with France? Say Bengal trade with France. Did they sell Bengal products to, say, Indonesia or other places? So just the nature of the trade, that they were engaged in Bengal and about inter-Asia trade or whatever. Second question is, when you read books by mainly English authors about the Battle of Plassey, they say on the day, the French were there, with the Nawabs army, and they had their guns kind of ready, right? And then you had the first round of fighting. The British didn't really gain much advantage. But then midday, something like that, heavy rain started to pour in. And the British protected their cannons, and gunpowders, but the French didn't. Now, French was an European army. Why wouldn't they cover their gunpowders? And why did the British do it? Or is it just a British way of showing how stupid the French were? What was the truth about it?
Yeah. Yes. So on maybe on the second question first, I don't know. I don't know how much of the kind of English accounts you read of Plassey are really accurate, how much they are myth. I think there's a lot of myth making about Plassey in the 19th century, a lot of dressing up as a battle, what may not even really have been a battle. I think Plassey is significant because, of course, it leads to the removal of Siraj as Nawab, but it's not a large-scale military engagement like the fighting that follows in Bengal and Bihar through 1759, 1760, 1761, through really until 1764, and the defeat of that kind of that coalition against the English at Buxar. So on the specific point about gunpowder and rain, I simply don't know. But I think there's been a tendency probably to overplay the importance of Plassey in that history, and also to give it more credit than it's worth as a battle, I suppose, as a military moment. On intra-Asian trade, yes, definitely the French East India Company and French private traders are engaged in trade across the Indian Ocean. They are in Southeast Asia in this period. There are several French expeditions to China. Louis, so right at the beginning of the company, really, the 1680s, 1690s, Louis XIV is fascinated by China and encouraging the company to find a way into the Chinese kingdom or empire. It's in the 1680s that the first French attempt to colonize modern day Thailand takes place, Siam, and there's extensive trade between French colonies in India and Siam. Most of that trade is via Pondicherry, rather than setting off from Chandernagore. Pondicherry, yes, is the place where ships from Europe arrive. It's the stopping off point for ships that are then going on to Southeast Asia. And so it's only really, as I mentioned in the talk, from the 1730s that an intra-Asian French trade really takes off from Bengal with other places around the Indian Ocean, when Dupleix is governor in Bengal. That's the period where we begin to see quite significant trading expeditions, heavily financed, put together by Dupleix and other French figures, but also attracting the investment of the English and the Dutch in this period. It's not uncommon for Europeans of different nationalities to kind of club together and set up these temporary companies to launch expeditions from Bengal to the Persian Gulf, to Southeast Asia, and yes, in a few instances to China as well.
Thanks, Robert. We have a question from Naomi Caligaro. She says, apologies if this was covered when I was briefly out of the room. Could you comment, please, on the Bourbon family, especially Kings Louis XVI and XVIII, and colonialism? Were they interested in having French colonies? How did they view the British in India?
Yeah, okay. India is never the priority of the French monarchy. I think it's fair to say the priority from the time of Louis XIV is always North America and the Caribbean first, as far as international trade, and then territorial expansion and settlement is concerned. And only after that is it really India. As far as Louis XVI is concerned, I mean, it's similar, really. When war breaks out between Britain and France, in just following the revolution, the focus is again on protecting French territories in the Caribbean and in America. There seems to be a recurring pattern where forces, French royal forces, particularly the Navy, the Marine, they are dispatched to India, but they consistently arrive too late, to the frustration of the French at Pondicherry and Chandernagore, who watch with envy, really, the way in which the English East India Company seems to have the quicker support of its national government. Each time a new war starts between the two countries. As far as Louis XVIII is concerned, as I mentioned at the start, my new project is looking at the French presence in India more widely. So yeah, it will be interesting for me to see later on, I think, how by the time Louis XVIII is on the throne, things have changed. I don't have a definitive answer at this stage. India, of course, features, at least briefly, in French plans during the Napoleonic Wars, but there too, it's more aspiration than reality, this idea of invading India and dislodging the English from their, increasingly hegemonic position.
Thanks, Robert. Please ask your questions either in the chat box or just raise your hands and I can take them in order. Robert, I wanted to ask you about your archival research in Bengal. Since your work is on the Hooghly, and I'm sure you've, other than Chandanagar, you have covered places like Srirampur and Bandel and other places. So what were the archives that we were looking at in these, smaller towns? So if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, okay. The archival research that I've done in Bengal dates to when I was doing my PhD. So thinking here about 9 or 10 years ago, where I spent quite a bit of time in the West Bengal State Archives in Kolkata. And it was while I was doing research for what then was an entirely different project that I visited many of the places on the river that feature in the book and began formulating the idea of writing about them. The book itself relies on the records of the English East India Company, which of course the British Library, the French East India Company, whose records are in France, in Paris, and in Aix-en-Provence. But beyond that, the book relies heavily on, I guess, published travel accounts. It does lean as well, I guess, by its nature, really, on other published work by other scholars, particularly when it comes to the Portuguese and the Dutch. So it's a mixture, really. I wanted to write something when I set off to write the book that would appeal to a wider audience. The chapters on the English and French are more backed up by archival research than the others, which I guess is the nature of writing a book that wants to look at those different trading companies and by extension is relying on research that's been done in lots of different languages.
Thank you. Any more questions for Robert? Yes, I think we have two people. Naomi, would you like to go first? Naomi Alam.
I see one comment from, sorry, no, it's a different Naomi.
Yeah.
In the chat.
Yeah, I see a hand up from Naomi Alam, if you want to ask your question. And then we have Shopon Adnan.
Okay. My question is, we've had a very detailed blow-by-blow account of contentions between the French, the British, and also the local rulers in and around Bengal.
Mm.
But I wonder if you have a more overarching view of what were the principal determinants of the outcome in terms of external factors as compared to or as contrasted to local rivalries. I'm thinking of the wars and the peace treaties between France and Britain in other arenas in the Atlantic and so on. Were these more powerful determinants of what happened in Bengal, or was it the endogenous balance of forces in Bengal which shapes things? What is your assessment of that?
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting question. As far as the commercial success of the English and French trading companies is concerned, from the outset, the French company struggles. The reason why no successful French company or no French company is successfully founded before 1664 is because it's very difficult to raise investment for it from private investors, as I mentioned. And from the beginning, the French company in India is struggling as a result of a shortage of funds, basically. The economic thinking of the day, mercantilist theory of the day, but the French directors of the company and the French monarchy are very heavily wedded to prevents or tries to limit as much as possible the export of bullion, of gold and silver from France. Exporting money basically to finance purchases in India is considered a drain on the resources of the nation. That's far more so the case in France than in England in this period. Raising private investment is much easier in England and the Dutch Republic in this period. England and the Netherlands have national banks that help the process along that France doesn't in this period. So I think there are lots of external factors, European factors, that can explain the commercial success of the English, or the Dutch, and then the English companies relative to the French. As far as the competition that then leads to the English ascendancy in Bengal is concerned, the political ascendancy. The English company is widely considered to have the best ships and the best navigators. That can't be overlooked. There are studies comparing rates of ships managing to arrive in India from Europe in this period across different European nations, and France is far behind when it comes to that kind of maritime performance, I suppose. But even more so than that, the main factor, I think, the main external factor that's important is the support that each trading company receives from its national government. The French monarchy is enthusiastic at the outset under Louis XIV, and while Colbert is in power, but very quickly, as soon as the 1670s, the French government has been distracted by war with the Dutch in Europe, and the development of a territorial empire in Europe is more important to the French than international trade and overseas expansion is. We should remember that this is the period where France, as we know it today, the nation state is in the process of being formed, new territories are being annexed, and that, rather than territories overseas, is always the military priority. When it does come to overseas expansion, America is always a bigger priority than India, which is often considered as a bit of an afterthought. And yeah, as I mentioned, each time a war breaks out between, well, first of all, France and the Netherlands, and then later France and England. In India, the English company seems to receive more quickly and more substantially the support of its government and, well, concretely, the navy and the army of its country. So those external factors are undoubtedly very important. On the ground in Bengal, the very small numbers of French troops that are present throughout the period is very important, because even within India, or among the French in India, Bengal is of lesser importance than southern India. And even in the 1760s, it's, even after the loss of the Carnatic, I guess, its French forces are tied up fighting for the Nizam of the Deccan, Salabat Young. The English are very conscious that the longer the fighting goes on in southern India during the 7 Years' War, the better it is, even if that fighting is essentially at a stalemate in the south, because it prevents any serious French attempts to on Bengal, or to retake or to dislodge the English from Bengal.
Thanks, Robert. Naomi, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Priyanka, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Yeah, there was a problem with the microphone, I think, and you couldn't hear me. My question is, it's kind of a comparative question, Robert. A very interesting talk. Thank you so much. Very enlightening. But I've kind of read a little bit, and my knowledge is very limited. But I found Shashi Tharoor's book, An Era of Darkness. It was absolutely enlightening because he touched upon the lives of people that were affected by British colonialism. So it doesn't just look at commerce, it actually looks at how people on the ground were affected. In comparison, you've done research on Dutch colonization, you've looked at the French, you've looked at the Portuguese. How do they fare when it comes to, I'll be very blunt, how do they fare when it comes to violence and savagery in keeping that control? How did they, in comparison to the British colonial era, were they any better, were they any worse, or was it on an equal par?
Thanks. It's another good question. I mean, as far as Bengal specifically is concerned, there's no doubt that the English presence in Bengal is, the most long-lasting and the most damaging for Bengal. And as hopefully my talk flagged up, there are individuals, there are writers and thinkers in Europe, in England and in France, who by the middle of the 1760s are realizing what is happening in Bengal. They're realizing that the drain of resources from Bengal has begun, that the English presence in Bengal has essentially become a military occupation, and that revenue is being extracted from Bengal. By the time that the third edition of the text written by Denis Diderot is published later in the 1770s, text that I mentioned in my talk, the Bengal famine of 1770-71 has happened, and Diderot is aware of that and links it very firmly to English practices of revenue collection and military devastation of the Bengali countryside. When we look beyond Bengal, it's difficult, I guess, to start making more difficult to start making those broad comparisons across different contexts. But it might be possible to say that from the beginning, the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean is very violent from the outset, and slavery is an integral part of it. The same can be said of the Dutch presence in Southeast Asia, and I guess to a significant extent, but perhaps a lesser extent, in India, when the Dutch arrive in India. For the French, there is no attempt to separate commerce from colonization and conquest really from the beginning. So the aborted French attempt to colonize Madagascar, the French East India Company's very first expedition in 1665, is extremely violent. The opposition on Madagascar to the French presence is violently suppressed, and large numbers of people are enslaved. Slavery is the other key aspect of violence that should be spoken about, I guess, in any kind of comparison of this nature. Possibly at the outset, the English East India Company in India, at least, perhaps more so than the Dutch and French and the Portuguese, tries to keep separate territorial acquisition and conquest from commerce.
I remember you also mentioned that there was a significant difference in the British colonization period, where you said that there wasn't so much of a push to keep commerce separate from, the British decided that it would be better to keep commerce quite separate from missionaries or this kind of push to bring Christianity into the subcontinent. Was there any specific reason for that?
Yeah, I think the English and the Dutch simply think that missionaries are bad for their business, basically. They have an understanding from early on that, or certainly, well, no, perhaps not from early on. Let's go back a step. I mean, by the time that English rule has been established in Bengal and elsewhere in South Asia, there is a real wariness about having missionaries present in the East India Company's territories, because the sense that they're likely to provoke opposition, that they're going to cause trouble, basically. So there is definitely an attempt to keep commerce and Christianization separate.
Quite interesting, because now that you mention it, it does kind of make sense that values of any kind, whether they're Christian or whatever, would get in the way of methods or methodology that would be questionable. That does kind of make sense. Thank you. Brilliant.
The comparison with the French is, I guess, important. In the French case, I mentioned that the French company is far more closely aligned to the French state, that the monarch and French ministers of the crown play a far more hands-on role in the French East India Company. And of course, the French state in this period is a Catholic state. So even if directors of the French company would have liked to keep missionaries separate from what they were doing, I don't think the political context in France before the revolution would have made that possible.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. I was wondering about the travelogues that you mentioned, which form, some of the resources of the research that you've done. Are there any women's travelogues in here?
Are there any women's travelogues? One or two. There are not many, women with a high profile or a public profile in this period. In the first chapter of Hugli, that kind of absence is noted. The only references to women in the Portuguese colony are women who are wives or concubines, or I guess prostitutes or slaves. That's really the only references to women that we read. The policy of the French in this period is, at the beginning, that women shouldn't travel to India. But by about 1700, so by about 30 years of the company's presence in India, 30, 35, we do begin to see the arrival of, wives and daughters, I suppose, of French employees, or employees of the French East India Company. The earliest travelogue or diary, I suppose, a journal by a French woman in this period, is by the wife of the French governor, Joseph Francois Duplay, that I mentioned. Her mother is a Tamil from the region around Pondicherry. Her father is a French officer at Pondicherry. She becomes influential in southern India, in Pondicherry, in this period. She plays a political role, a commercial role, I guess, because of her, not least because of her knowledge of Tamil. Most French men in this period are not good at learning languages. So she is an extremely important asset for that reason as well. There are one or two others in the French case later in the 18th century. But yeah, there's certainly a small minority.
Thank you. I have one more question before I take Ahmedullah's question. I can see his hand is up. You mentioned the influence of French ideas, the Enlightenment on the Bengal Renaissance. I was wondering about the role that Chandanagar played in the Swadeshi movement later on, the Home Rule movement. How far do you think those ideas were influencing the Swadeshi movement in this area? Or are there at all any influences there? Or what do you think?
I think there are. I'm not, I'm definitely not an expert on the Swadeshi movement and events at the beginning of the 20th century in Bengal. In this period, as Indian or Bengali nationalism is beginning to rise, Chandanagar is a refuge for figures who are trying to avoid the English, basically, trying to avoid English authority. Because Chandanagar is under French jurisdiction, it's a place where nationalists can hang out, basically, and print and write and say what they want without fear of consequences. So Chandanagar is important for that reason in the kind of political history of Bengal. In terms of the kind of intellectual or ideological influences, Hooghly, the book, studies those influences as far as the Bengal Renaissance is concerned through the figure of Ramahan Roy. He was influenced and acknowledges his debt to, lots of people, but among them, French Enlightenment figures. As far as Swadeshi is concerned, there have been some interesting studies about, I'm sure there are lots of people who know much more about it than me, but I imagine that those links do exist, yes.
Yes, when I asked the question, I was thinking about the revolutionary Kanailal, who's such a prominent figure in Chandanagar. I mean, there's a boys' school named after him, Kanailal Vidya Mandir. So I was thinking on those terms in terms of the Indian national movement. Ahmedullah, if you want to ask your question.
It's a comment, and then see if I am right, or more or less. This is in terms of comparative violence, between different European powers in the Indian Ocean. Based on my understanding, the British were least violent, until after Battle of Plassey. It seems, from the beginning when the British entered 1602 Indian Ocean, through East India Company. I know there were some part successful expedition of the English, into the Indian Ocean. But the Dutch, from the very beginning were quite violent. The Portuguese were violent, but their violence in the Indian subcontinent was limited because they didn't have the manpower to really take vast territories. So Goa and coastal areas, in Gujarat, but they were quite brutal in Bengal. They had a settlement in Hooghly, but they, all the slavery and taking slaves, they were quite violent, right? The French, except you mentioning Madagascar, I can't think of many. My knowledge is, by the way, limited, but I can't think of many other violent actions of French, within the Indian Ocean area. So I would say personally, the British killed off more people immediately, within a short period after the Battle of Plassey, not through murder and violence, but through famine, extracting money and starving the people. But in terms of brutality against people, killing thousands, deliberately, I think Portuguese and the Dutch were probably, more guilty of that, than the British and the French. What's do you think I'm more or less okay, or what do you think?
Yeah. As far as the French and the English are concerned, I think we have to, well, as far as the English are concerned, we have to go back slightly further than Plassey, I would say, to start dating the moment where warfare becomes a more systematic part of what the English East India Company is doing. We should say really that there are wars fought by all of the European trading companies in this period in India and the Indian Ocean. And each time there is a war in Europe between European powers, that war spills over into the Indian Ocean, beginning in the talk again today with the war between the French and the Dutch in India in the 1670s. So in that sense, there is a spillover of European violence into the Indian Ocean from the beginning, really. In terms of a more kind of systematic use of violence to inform kind of conquest, for the English, we probably have to look slightly before Plassey to maybe 1750, when the decision is made by the English to get involved in the upheavals in southern India to oppose French expansion. So maybe 1750 is an important date. As far as the French are concerned, there are these wars with the Dutch and with the English in the 1670s and the 1690s and the 1710s. So there is war from the beginning, and there is the threat of the use of violence from the beginning. You know, as we saw, the charter of the French company legitimizes the use of violence, the seizure of territories, the making of war on non-Christians from the outset. Madagascar, is the most striking example of that in the early decades of the company. But
it's like killing ordinary people, you know, like the brutality against locals. That's what I was thinking about. I know there were wars between the English and the Dutch, even at the beginning, you know, and the Spice Islands, you know, race for the Spice Islands and so on. And then the Portuguese and the English, you know, near Gujarat, even from the very beginning. But brutality against local people, you know, right?
Yes, yeah.
That's what I was sort of talking about.
Yeah, no, it's a good distinction. It's a good distinction to make. I think it's probably only in the French case from the 1750s as well that we certainly see a lot more of that brutality from the 1750s in southern India with the French, whether it's the byproduct of war with the English or something or something else. So the French are not kind of immune to that either.
Thank you, Robert. I don't see any more questions, so I think this might be a good time to wrap up. So please join me to thank Robert for his wonderful presentation. Big round of applause. I'm yet to read your book on Hooghly, and I think it's just a wonderful addition to the kind of research that is going on in terms of the history of rivers, and books like The History of the Ganga by Sudipto Sen or The History of the Brahmaputra by Aurobjyoti Saikia. So this is just fascinating work, and I wish you all the best for your future project. Thank you to the audience for joining us today, and I will now hand over to Ahmedullah if he has to say any final words before closing the session off. Thank you.
Final word. Thank you, Robert. It was really a wonderful presentation. It gave me like chronological perspectives, and linkages between different things happening at different times. So it was really good for enhancing my own sort of reading and understanding. And Priyanka did a brilliant chairing job, as always. Thank you, Priyanka, and everybody else who joined and participated. We still have quite a few sessions to go during this Bengal History Week, extended to month this year. So please do join. Just want to tell you that our comedy, we're having a comedy, setting up a comedy club, Brick Lane Circle Comedy Club. So our first show is this Saturday, sold out. Our next one is in November 13th. So when you see publicity, please book early, because that might get sold out as well very quickly. So thank you, and see you at the next session. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.